Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to the New Books Network. My name is Leo Bader, and today we're talking to Minxin Pei, Professor of Government and George R. Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College. Minxin's new book, The Sentinel State, Surveillance and the Survival of Dictatorship in China, examines the emergence and structure of the Chinese surveillance apparatus that has become infamous around the world. Beyond explaining the rise and organization of the surveillance state, the book looks at Chinese surveillance within the context of China's authoritarian regime, which has persisted despite claims that economic modernization would lead to political liberalization, and points to the surveillance state as an explanation for why this has not happened. The book is historically rich and unquestionably relevant, so Minxin, thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure, Leo.
So why don't you start with a very simple question, which is defining for us what exactly we should think about when we talk about a surveillance state. And I'm sure people are thinking of CCTV cameras or of high-tech internet spying, but what is the full breadth of what we're thinking about here?
It's a great question. I think in the popular imagination or the conventional wisdom, the surveillance state is too narrowly seen as just a bunch of hardware, cameras, AI, computers. But in reality, that is the hardware and the technological part is only one piece of this whole apparatus. A surveillance state obviously involves people because machines cannot arrest people. Machines cannot intimidate people. So as for people that secret police, informers, officials who are responsible in making decisions actually constitute the bulk of the surveillance state. And the surveillance state also involves tactics. How do you actually deploy the people and the hardware? So the surveillance state is really a very comprehensive system, talking about organizational structure, the use of technology, and tactics.
So why don't we start at the beginning then? Where does the Chinese surveillance state have its roots? And if you want to give us a stylized history of how it then gets to where it is today.
Well, if you want to go very far back, then we're talking about 9th, 10th century, where the Imperial China developed the concept of so-called Bao and Jia. That is, they would divide a local community into smaller units. Say 10 households will constitute one unit. And the idea is that all 10 households would share joint responsibility for watching each other. So if one of the people from one of the households, from the 10 households committed a crime, then the other 9 would be responsible. So this is where I think you would have the roots of the modern Chinese surveillance state. Part of the Chinese system today resembles that institutional invention many, many years. But I think what the modern Chinese surveillance state was really a hybrid of Chinese tradition, bureaucratic organization, and the Soviet system. Because the Chinese Communist Party modeled itself after the Soviet Communist Party. So when the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, the Soviet Union sent over their policing experts and tried to sort of teach China how to organize modern surveillance. So China copied parts of the Soviet system, but also China adapted the system to Chinese conditions. So this is so that was the 1950s. So this is where when the surveillance state began to take shape. And then over time, it evolved. So one thing I want to make sure is that when China was founded, People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, China was very, very poor, was dirt poor. So it could not employ a lot of secret police. But secret policemen are expensive. You have to train them, you have to pay them. It did not really have much technology. So it had to rely on what you might call people's war, That is, it had to rely on a lot of volunteers. It had to rely on the party's organizational capabilities to watch potential enemies.
And thinking about things like the Soviets bringing policing experts into China to help them develop a modern surveillance state, would you say that most of the development was very deliberate and structured, or did a lot of it come through kind of ad hoc additions to surveillance and different experimentation?
I think it's a mixture. So in terms of institutions, certainly they copied the Soviet internal security system, but they also rejected the Soviet suggestion that China should have one super secret police agency like the KGB, which would be responsible for both domestic spying and external espionage. So from the very early on, one of the most interesting things about China in the Maoist era, and to a lesser extent today, is that China's spying apparatus actually looked very similar to the U.S. spying system and the U.K. system, which is that they separate domestic spying from external espionage. So in the UK, you have MI5, which is domestic spying, and MI6, which is espionage. And the US is FBI, domestic spying, and then espionage, which is CIA. China copied their system. So the KGB and the former Soviet bloc, they all, including East Germany, they all merged everything into one super agency, which in the Chinese, I'm not seeing any sort of documentary evidence on why China chose to embrace the Western system rather than the Soviet system. But I suspect Mao and his colleagues were very worried that if you have a super spying agency, then that spy agency would be too powerful. I think probably they were right.
So coming to today then, what does the Chinese surveillance system look like? How do they combine both low-tech, labor-intensive approaches, but also at the same time incorporate new technologies and ultimately survive as a regime as long as they have, which is obviously kind of a core question of your book.
Okay. I think so organizationally, the Chinese system is much better organized than the Soviet system. For example, the party wants to ensure that its policies and instructions are completely carried out, implemented. For that to happen, the Chinese Communist Party has a specialized party bureaucracy called the Political Legal Committee. The Soviet Union and East Germany didn't have a specialized party bureaucracy. So in that case, the Chinese system is much more specialized. From top to bottom, hierarchically hierarchical coordination is much better today. So this is about the organization. So from the party perspective, then the sort of labor-intensive low-tech side, obviously they have secret police, they have police, but the number of uniformed police in China is relatively small. That's because uniformed police is expensive. They've expanded a lot compared with the 1980s. I think the size of the police, the secret police, more than doubled. But still, on a per capita basis, China's, in terms of per policeman, one policeman per population, China roughly is about half of what the U.S. So China is much less policed than the U.S. But China has, by my estimate, probably 10 million informants. So if you add that, that's a huge sort of human asset. That's a low tech part. And they are spread all throughout the country, universities, colleges, shops, not restaurants, hotels, airports. So these are volunteers. Some of them are paid, most of them are not paid. So that helps the police a lot. A lot of them engage in what I would call conventional law enforcement. But quite a few of them engage in political spying. That is, watching out for dissidents or people who are on certain blacklists. So this is the human aspect, the labor part. And then you have the high-tech part. The high-tech part was built built in the starting period of the modernization of China's technological surveillance state began in the late 1980s. So they've been at it for the 1990s. They've been going at it for, we're talking about more than two decades. So over this period, they systematically modernized the IT system. So the police now has access to huge database. They're integrated. Then they started building the equipment to monitor the internet, the Great Firewall of China. Then they began to build in early part of this century. They began to build the cameras to monitor people, and gradually they integrated the surveillance, the cameras into cloud computing, modern AI, facial recognition. So this is a rather kind of evolutionary process. Over time, they increased the coverage of visual surveillance, and so today it's I would say, probably the world's most capable surveillance state.
At the Museum of the Secret Police of the East German state in Berlin, they have a map of some German neighborhoods, some Berlin neighborhoods, showing dots where each informant lived, and it's quite incredible. It's like several on each block. So I imagine maybe a map of some denser parts of China similar.
Well, some some of those informants are actually publicly known. So you can, when in the process of researching the book, I would find a list of informants on university websites. They're sort of publicly recruited. People know who they are.
I'm curious about the volunteer informants that are not paid. Does their desire to be an informant come from an ideological affinity with the Chinese state that they...
No, I think most of them are not ideological, because the Communist Party controls a lot of opportunities, a lot of resources. So if the Communist Party official comes to say, Leo, would you like to be informant? If you say no, you're in trouble, right? So you would say yes. But what I found what's interesting is that there is this headline number, 10 million, 12 million. But do all 10 million people actually watch other people? Do they actually spy on other people? The actual number probably is about 40%. So the real number of informants is a lot less. So how do you explain the discrepancy? I have a plausible explanation. That is, the local officials would use the number of informants as part of their performance record. So they would sign up a lot of people, whoever they asked. So they would sort of put their names down, and the list would grow quite impressive. But once they sign them up, they actually don't force them to spy. Some of them are more active than others. But spying on other people is not exactly a very pleasant business. Right? So most of them don't want to do this. So as a result, more than half of them don't provide any piece of information. And for the party official, it does not make a lot of sense to follow up on these people, because if they provide a lot of information on subversive activities, it does not reflect well on the party official, right? It means he's not doing a good job maintaining stability in his jurisdiction. So it's much more complicated, but it's quite interesting.
I want to talk about a key relationship in your book, which is that between the surveillance state and economic modernization in China. Um, Obviously, having this very labor-intensive form of surveillance for those that you are paying will be quite costly, and having the bureaucratic structures to support that will be quite costly. So in this sense, does China's rapid economic growth actually maybe that make that surveillance state easier to maintain simply because they can afford it?
Yes, absolutely. Because the great leap forward in China's surveillance state really occurred after Tiananmen, after 1989. Before, I think, 1991, the total spending on domestic security is like 10 billion yuan, which is nothing. Today, we're talking about 10 trillion. No, 1 trillion yuan. That is huge difference. And that's because the Chinese economy has grown significantly. Uh, and as I said earlier, in post 1989 China, they doubled the number of policemen. That's expensive. Right? And they began to invest in surveillance technology. So availability of resources is a key requirement for developing an expensive and capable surveillance state. So from that perspective, you can argue that at least in the short term, economic development probably is not good for democracy because it cuts both ways. On the one hand, you would have the rise of the middle class, access to information, so on and so forth, that would make democracy much more likely. But at the same time, you increase the state's capacity for repression, technologically or in terms of organization. So in the book, I say it's essentially a race that which side moves faster would win. In the last 30 years, unfortunately, the surveillance side, the sort of the repressive side, moved much faster than the pro-democracy side.
I'm curious about whether increasing surveillance and I imagine the increasing sort of sense of repression that might take hold among the Chinese population, whether that can lead to increasing resentment that sort of makes the task of the surveillance state harder and harder as people become more frustrated with the fact that they are being surveilled and sort of a vicious circle that eventually might lead to instability.
Yeah, I would say frustration will not rise because of surveillance. Most people's attitude towards state surveillance is very ambiguous, ambivalent, because they think it also helps control crime, for example. So they pay a price of some loss of privacy, but they also feel a little bit safer. This is actually not that uncommon. Even in democratic countries, you go to the UK, the surveillance is huge. And I think in parts of the US, you're beginning to have the same problem as well. So it's not the surveillance, some anger about surveillance. It's really about other things. So in my book, I said, the surveillance state has worked really well in China for about 3 decades. But these 3 decades are very special 3 decades. These are the 3 decades of fast economic growth, of plenty of job opportunities, ever-rising standard of living. So the number of people being watched by this apparatus is relatively small. The blacklist is about some 10 million people. That's less than 1% of the population. But imagine a future in which unemployment is very high, standard of living is stagnant, people feel very upset, very pessimistic about the future. You're not going to watch just 10 million people, right? The number of potential subversives could rise to 30 million. The question is, can the surveillance state deal with 30 million to 50 million very, very unhappy people? My answer is not. So that's the real problem is the overall economy, overall society rather than the capability of the surveillance state per se.
Right. It makes sense that if people are happy with their rising standard of living with a seemingly growing economy, then the fact that there are more cameras on the street corners might be a much lower concern. But I suppose also because China's surveillance is much more reliant on informants and, as you say, not uniformed police. If that discontent were to rise, the capacities for more hard repression are perhaps not proportional to potential discontent.
Oh yeah, I think so there can be several scenarios. For example, it will be much harder to recruit informants. They would demand pay, right? Today, then by volunteer. But in a sort of a bad economic situation, they would like to get some compensation for what they do. So the cost is high, and in a bad economy, the state will have less resources, which means the tech piece will not get upgraded as frequently or as efficiently as before. The police might not actually be you might not be able to train and expand the police force. So I think a bad economy can hurt the Chinese Communist Party's capacity to govern from many, many directions.
I want to talk about the distinction that you make between preventive and reactive repression, which is, I'm sure, very important for much of what we've already talked about. But how does preventive repression, stopping discontent from even really materializing or being able to manifest, enable the survival of an authoritarian state? And what does this require in terms of concrete surveillance to make happen, to make work?
Yeah. Okay. First, let me talk about sort of reactive repression. The Tiananmen crackdown is a typical example. That is, you have 1 million people in the square. You are on the verge of a revolution, and the regime probably is on the verge of collapse. Then, as a last resort, you have to use the military. This kind of reactive repression is very costly, extremely dangerous. Just think, what if the army decided not to pull the trigger? Then the regime is gone, right? And even if the army did pull the trigger, their reputational loss is huge. The party could be split because a lot of people inside the Chinese Communist Party or inside any dictatorship really did not want to use such brutal methods to deal with people. It does not reflect well on them. So you could have division within the regime. So reactive repression is, so if you can avoid it, you would like to avoid it. So how do you avoid reactive repression? That is, you prevent 1 million people from going to the square. So that would require an extensive apparatus that would identify who these people are, right? Because you want to know who are most likely to organize and participate in anti-regime activities. And second, you identify that then you have to place them under some kind of surveillance. So that would require technological means, tap their phones, put cameras in their neighborhood, and you also need muscle. You need people, actual human beings, colleagues, neighbors, to watch them, right? So that's it's really about intelligence. Once you know who they are, what they want to do, then before they can actually act, you will send a couple of policemen to knock on their door and say, "We know what you're up to." So that way, even if you do not, because that way any collective action can be prevented. And even if, now, the thing about surveillance is that it generates pervasive distrust. So, Liu, how can you trust your closest friend? Is your neighbor actually spying for the government? So the fear, suspicion would paralyze you, would prevent you from engaging in any activities. We live in the U.S. We're very lucky, right? But you just suppose that this could happen in the U.S. a lot of people would take precautions. And that's exactly what preventive repression seeks to accomplish. That is, it wants to use fear, suspicion, distrust to prevent collective action from taking place.
If you can get a reputation for managing to find the people planning some sort of subversive action, then eventually, I guess, people will stop trying in the first place.
Of course, yes. Oh, sometimes, of course, sometimes you make examples of them. You arrest some. In my book, I talk about kidnapping people. That is because another thing that is sort of a preventive, that you have to use sophisticated tactics. It's about intelligence and intimidation. So in China, there are key dates like June 4th, because key day when you want to organize collective action or protests, a big obstacle is coordination. In any society, there are a lot of unhappy people, but they don't know when or where they should meet to protest. So June 4th, a particular date, is of this date most people know. So if they want to express their anger at the government, so June 4th is a very good date. So the Chinese government knows this too. So before June 4th, they will arrest activists. They would step up internet censorship. So that's all part of this preventive repression.
You've already mentioned this a little bit, but I want to talk about the Leninist structure of the Chinese government, which you argue is particularly well suited to having a successful surveillance state, even more than other forms of dictatorship. So break down the structure for us a little bit, and how does it contribute to surveillance?
Well, when you compare, say, a personal dictatorship like Mubarak in Egypt, or even Saudi Arabia, right? Which is a family business, with China, the biggest difference is that in China, a Leninist regime, which is a Leninist party, has a party organization at every level of the government. And that party organization has very specific division of labor. It recruits politically loyal elements. And the party has presence throughout society, college, factories, neighborhoods. So, to use academic jargon, the regime has deep penetration in society, which facilitates recruitment of informants. So if you live in a country without a Leninist system, actually it will be pretty hard to know who the local party boss is. But in China, everybody knows who the local party boss is. So it's a lot easier for the party to mobilize manpower. And since the party has an organizational presence in all major social and economic institutions and organizations, then the party can control all of them. So the extent of control is much more solid in a Leninist system. So this is one. And second, how do you ensure that a particular policy made at the very top gets fully implemented? It's actually pretty hard for Saudi Arabia to do the same kind of things China does. But in China, because the Leninist system is hierarchical, that is, as I said, every level of government, there is a party organization. So all Xi Jinping needs to do is to announce a policy, and then the policy gets implemented at every level from top down. So that makes the Leninist system much more effective as an instrument of government.
Has it been impeded by corruption at all?
Corruption is certainly a big problem. Yeah, because but by and large, all dictatorships are corrupt. But dictatorships that are corrupt but also capable can survive longer than dictatorships that are corrupt and incompetent.
I want to end by asking you to speculate a little bit, if that's all right. What do you think the future of Chinese surveillance might look like? And how would you evaluate its chances of continuing to remain as effective as it's been? We've seen in the past few years a little bit of a slowdown in the growth of the Chinese economy, but perhaps one that has been better managed in the end than some of the slowdowns in Western economies that we've seen. So is there a chance that the kind of economic downturn that you say would be needed to knock the legs away from the surveillance state might not materialize for the foreseeable future, or am I wrong in that?
Yeah. I would say that in terms of the speed of modernization, probably the best days are behind it. That is, the last 25 years has really seen a qualitative and a quantitative improvement. So more or less it's plateaued. However, so this is a pretty high plateau. So we're going to see incorporation of more high tech. Yeah, I think in the future, that is, the human part, the labor organizational piece will be relatively stagnant because they've already reached a pretty high level. The tech piece will continuously improve. And that's because we're seeing a lot of new tech being developed and incorporated, like AI, right? In my book, I did not even touch on AI because it was not really there. And then you would see a lot of sort of biometric data, genetic information, all of these things. So I think the tech, and another thing that we sort of talked about but did not really have a lot of information on is the social credit system. We don't hear a lot about this. Maybe in the future they don't need us anymore because generative AI can do a pretty good job of predictive policing. So I would say next 5-10 years, you might see sort of some focused improvement in China's surveillance capabilities.
But perhaps there's a sense, if I'm trying to have an optimistic outlook, that regardless of the tech available, ultimately, as you mentioned earlier, the fact still stands that if you have 30 million or 40 million people,
absolutely,
10. So,
surveillance alone cannot save the Communist Party. Repression alone, because if a regime survives because it has a lot of tools: economic growth, nationalism, charismatic leadership, so on and so forth. If you have just one tool, then you become North Korea. Well, you can still survive, but it's pretty miserable.
Well, that is unfortunately all the time we have. Minxin's book, The Sentinel State, Surveillance, and the Survival of Dictatorship in China, can be purchased through the link in the New Books Network. If you're interested in more of his work, you're in luck. Minxin has 3 other books: China's Crony Capitalism, The Dynamics of Regime Decay; China's Trapped Transition, The Limits of Developmental Autocracy; and From Reform to Revolution, The Demise of Communism in China and the Soviet Union. Minxin, thanks again for joining us today.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thank you, Leo.